Ah yes, it is once again time to do some wild speculating for the upcoming NHL expansion draft this summer for the Seattle Kraken. And this time, even more than usual, I do mean wildly speculating, because the team we're talking about today definitely has some things to figure out before the expansion draft rolls around. Like the Jets in the previous video in this series, the Wild are another one of the four teams that expanded at the turn of the century. And although, unlike the Thrashers, the Wild have been at least successful enough to stay in Minnesota since their expansion, it has not necessarily been a particularly smooth road for them. But as far as Seattle's concerned anyway, right now, Minnesota is pretty much the perfectly built team. Because even though they aren't necessarily a cup contender, or at least it doesn't look like they are, their roster is built in such a way that it has enough depth that if nothing were to change, they could be losing a pretty good player to Seattle. By the way, if you do find yourself enjoying this video at any point and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Now, I've already said this in a number of the other videos in this series to this point, but especially when it comes to the Wild, this roster is almost definitely going to look different by the time the expansion draft does roll around. And if it doesn't, well, that's something that Seattle would be all too happy to see. For the Wild, they find themselves in this situation largely due to the number of no movement clauses that they currently have on their roster, especially on the defensive end. But if there is one thing that I think is almost guaranteed at this point, it is that the Wild will be going the 7-3-1 protection route. So then we might as well jump into who I think is most likely to end up being protected on the forward end. And we might as well start with the two no movement clauses that they have there. Those two being Zach Parise and Matt Zuccarello. Now, it is potentially possible that either one of these guys could waive that no movement clause, and in that case, I don't think that either one would be terribly tempting for Seattle to pick up due to the contracts that they are currently on. But in the end, it's not up to Minnesota whether or not they can make those guys available because of those no movement clauses, so for now, we're going to say that they're protected. Beyond those two, the other two that I think would be safe if Minnesota were to for some reason go the 4-4 route would be Kevin Fiala and Marcus Johansson. And for Johansson, it's mostly just because he's a center and the Wild are struggling for depth at that particular position. But I still do think it's pretty unlikely this team ends up going the 4-4 route, as they will also want to be protecting Joel Eriksson-Ek, Jordan Greenway, and Marcus Foligno. Of course, then with the number of forwards that the Wild will want to be protecting, the question is, why would they even think about going the 4-4 route? And again, while I don't think it's particularly likely that they do, the reason for that is that if nothing were to change with this roster, they currently have 3 defensemen with no movement clauses, which means they could be losing Matt Dumba. But at least for the sake of my time and this video, it does make it pretty easy to decide who's going to be protected on the defensive end, with those 3 no movement clauses belonging to Jared Spurgeon, Ryan Suter, and Jonas Brodin. And then I suppose in goal, technically speaking, things I guess are a little bit less straightforward here, mostly because there just isn't a no movement clause, but with that being said, I do think that it's pretty likely at this point that Kaapo Kähkönen is the one that's going to be getting the protection slot there. So then really the only question here is whether or not the Wild can get Suter to waive his no movement clause. And much like Parise and Zuccarello on the forward end, I don't think that it's terribly likely that if he were to waive it, that Seattle would be overly tempted to pick him because of his contract. But again, he has a no movement clause for a reason, so there's no guarantee he would be willing to waive. But if he were to waive it, that would certainly make things much easier on the Wild, because again, as things stand right now, this leaves Matt Dumba available for Seattle to select, and that is not a player that the Wild would want to lose without getting anything back. Now, this last offseason did also see a number of rumors swirling around whether or not the Wild were going to try to trade Dumba before the season. But regardless of where those rumors came from, Dumba made it very clear that they were not from him, as he does like it in Minnesota. But regardless, obviously nothing did happen in the offseason, considering Dumba is still a part of the Wild, at least right now anyway. But if there were truth to those rumors and the Wild do still want to move Dumba, maybe for another center for example, then they will have until the April 12th trade deadline in order to do so. But if they can't or decide not to move Dumba by this summer and Suter decides not to waive his no movement clause, then Dumba becomes a pretty clear pick for the Kraken to take from this team, which then could end up tempting the Wild into making a side deal with the Kraken so that they can keep him. And they certainly do also have a number of contracts that they probably wouldn't mind Seattle helping them out with. Although, once again, a number of those are tied to no movement clauses that those players would also have to be involved in. But for now, let's look at some potentially available players for the Kraken to take, assuming this roster looks the same and those no movement clauses aren't waived. Here, if there was one of the guys from that protection list that could potentially slip through the cracks, whether or not it's the Wild having a different opinion on who they want to protect, or maybe they get a center via trade, then that would probably be Foligno. Now again, I don't know how likely it is that Foligno would end up unprotected, as he has started to take a bit of a leadership role on Minnesota's third line, but just in case, the 29-year-old winger has played in 10 NHL seasons with 577 games under his belt, having in that time 187 points on 77 goals and 110 assists. So, as you can probably tell from those stats, he's not necessarily the points-producing type of forward that you might see on a top line. However, he is definitely much more of the physical two-way type of player that you would see on a third line, filling that role pretty well, with usually somewhere around, if not more than, 200 hits per season in a full year. And for what it's worth from a points production standpoint, he is usually pretty consistent in that he's good for somewhere in the mid-20s in points. So, well, sure, if a Dumba type player is available, even if Foligno were available, he probably wouldn't be the Kraken selection. But especially considering there aren't going to be too many points producing type of forwards available, and this team probably will, at least in its first season, be much more of a physically intimidating type of team, built around defense more than points production and high-flying offense, then he could be a very good selection for more of a veteran presence. And on top of that, with Foligno signed through 2024 at just under $3 million per year, he would also help the Kraken fulfill some of their requirements when it comes to selecting players that are already under contract. And plus, for what it's worth on the contract front, at least at this current moment, the Wild only have 5 eligible players that are currently under contract. So if they don't want to expose Foligno, they will have to start signing some other forwards, which I think it's pretty safe to say they will definitely be doing, but it's still something to watch. But if it is a solid defensive forward with a decent amount of NHL experience that the Kraken are looking for when it comes to picking a player from the Wild, and Foligno is protected, then Nick Bonino is probably the player for them. At the age of 32, Bonino has played in at least part of 12 different NHL seasons for a number of different teams, in that time accruing 639 games with 285 points on 123 goals and 162 assists. And while, like Foligno, he's not necessarily known for being a points-producing forward, even though he does produce at a little bit more than Foligno does, he is much more well known for being a defensive forward. It's an aspect of his game, though, that probably shows up best when you look at his blocked shots, where he tends to be towards the top of the league amongst forwards, with somewhere between 70 to 90 plus blocked shots per season. And again, if it really is just points that you're after, even at the age of 31 last year, he had one of his better points producing seasons with 35 points in 67 games. But even outside of the stats for Bonino, he does also have one other thing in his career that, whether it's coincidental or not, the Kraken have shown that they tend to like when it comes to making other hirings that they have done so far in their front office. And that is cup-winning experience, having been a part of back-to-back cup-winning teams in Pittsburgh in 2016 and 2017. So if it is that veteran type of player with cup-winning experience that the Kraken want, then Bonino can definitely offer it for them. But I tend to lean a little bit more towards preferring some of the younger players that have a little bit more as far as years of service to offer Seattle. And if that is the case, then that is what Seattle is looking for, then either Nico Strum or Ryan Hartman are also likely to be available. The more experienced of the two being Hartman, who, at the age of 26, already has 7 NHL seasons under his belt with 328 games played, having put up 114 points on 53 goals and 61 assists in that time. Though 6 years younger, much like Bonino, Hartman has kind of bounced around the NHL, already on his 4th team now in those 7 seasons. So while he has had a bit of an up and down career so far to this point, scoring more points towards the beginning of it than in the last couple of seasons, some of that could be due to that number of changes in scenery that he has already had, and maybe with a more consistent home, he could start to pick up some of those points that he had in his early years. But even beyond that, though, in his last few stops, he has also been used as much more of a defensive forward, much like Bonino again, than he has been a points producer, which also definitely is contributing to some of those stats. And if you do happen to be more into the advanced stats and the possession type of metrics, then he does look a lot better here than either Bonino or Foligno did, where he has a career 51.9 Corsi for percentage and a 6.8 expected plus minus. with last year even offering some of his best stats in either one of those categories, with a 52.2 Corsi for percentage and a 7 expected plus minus. So when it comes to the Wild, the Kraken definitely could have a number of different options when it comes to maybe picking a defensive type of forward. But if they do want to have a forward that maybe has a little bit more points production, then they might have to go with more of a little bit of a gamble and a player that doesn't have as much experience at the NHL level. And that's where Strome could come into the mix. In spite of being just a year younger than Hartman at the age of 25, Strome's lack of NHL experience is due in large part to the fact that he spent 3 of the most recent years at the college level, where he was playing at Clarkson University between 2016 and 2019, where he did put up 103 points in 118 games. And then after getting a 2-game taste of the NHL in 2019, he spent most of last season at the AHL level, where he put up 32 points in 55 games before coming back to the NHL. So while granted at the NHL level he has yet to show much when it comes to points production, with just 2 points in 19 games, 19 games is hardly enough to judge a player off of, and when it comes to his other experience in the last few years, he has been able to put up quite a few more points than any of those other guys really were able to at the NHL level. So then as we get to the defensive end, again, as things stand right now, Dumba would be the player available, and he would be the player the Kraken would take. Outside of the fact that he would seem to be a perfect fit for Seattle, with both seemingly on the forefront of encouraging diversity in the game of hockey, he also would very clearly, with this current setup, be the best player available. And while granted, there are still plenty of different ways that Dumba probably will not end up being available for the Kraken to select, at least from the Wild anyway, just in case nothing does change and he is available, let's just take a quick look. At the age of 26, Dumba has played in 8 NHL seasons, having played 423 games where he has 179 points on 65 goals and 114 assists, which for a defenseman are pretty decent career stats when it comes to the type of player that will be available for the Kraken, but aren't necessarily the type of stats that would make him an obvious pick. And even if you were to look at last season where he had 24 points in 69 games, again, that's the type of stat line that, while it is pretty decent for a defenseman, is not necessarily the type of stat line that jumps out as a why is this guy available. However, Dumba's 2016 through 2019, or at least as much of that last season as he got to play, that is the chunk of time in his career that you look at and realize this guy could be a top-level defenseman. Especially that 2018 season where he had 50 points in 82 games, and on top of that had 112 blocked shots and 136 hits. And well, even at that, he's not quite the level of defenseman that's getting votes for, say, the Norris Trophy. He still definitely would be, at the age of 26, one of the best and most promising players that the Kraken would see available to them. Also keeping in mind the fact that he is also a right-handed shot, which when it comes to solid defensemen makes him a much more valuable asset. The other 2 names you might see come up for the Wild on the defensive end are Carson Soucy and Louis Belpedio. Neither one really has all that much to look at from a statistical point of view, with Soucy having more experience, having played in 69 NHL games with 16 points to show for it, most of that coming last season where he played 55 games, having 14 points. Meanwhile, 2 years younger, at the age of 24, Belpedio has only played 4 NHL games to this point in his career, with 2 points to show for it, both of those being assists that came in his first NHL game. That being said though, Soucy was last year anyway able to make some decent contributions to Minnesota's defense on the back end. Meanwhile, Belpedio, when it comes to the AHL level, is definitely the one that puts up a little bit more points, but even at that, he's not going to be a point-scoring type of player as a primary role. And then real quick to wrap up some other names that you might see potentially come up. On the goalie front, neither Cam Talbot or Alex Stalock are going to be tempting options for the Kraken. Both are 33, and there are better goalie options out there. 27-year-old centerman Victor Rask is another name that occasionally comes up, but he has not really lived up to his $4 million contract, which is set to go through the end of the 2022 season. And unless the Kraken knows something with all of their extra analytics and statistics that they're using that we don't about Victor Rask, I don't think he's the type of player that's going to be very tempting for them to take without being convinced to do so as a part of a trade. So for the Wild and their outlook, at least right now anyway, for the expansion draft coming up this summer, things look like these next couple of months could get pretty, well, wild. I'm sorry, it was right there, I couldn't resist. The 3 most likely scenarios, as I see them right now, is 1, Dumba ends up getting traded, and that solves their problem on the defensive end. Option 2 being the Wild managed to convince Suter to waive his no movement clause so they protect Dumba, and then option 3 being if nothing changes on the roster and Suter won't waive his no movement clause, then they probably make some sort of trade with the Kraken so that they don't pick Dumba. And to be fair, with the Wild, I do think that the potential for a side deal is actually a fairly decent one. Because once again, even outside of their issues with no movement clauses on the defensive end, they do have a number of unfavorable contracts that they would also probably like Seattle's help with. And as far as what they could give Seattle, well, there is always prospects, but they do also have a number of draft picks coming up with 2 first-rounders in this next draft and also 2 third-rounders, plus their full complement of draft picks otherwise over the next 3 seasons, with the only exception being missing their 7th-rounder in 2022. But if a side deal doesn't happen and Dumba doesn't end up being available, if it was me, I would be most tempted by either Susie on the defensive end or one of those defensive type of forwards on the forward end, whether that's Foligno or maybe Bonino if they decide to go more of the older veteran type of route, though I might personally lean more towards Hartman. But again, one more time with the Wild, anything could happen between now and July. So if you have made it to this point in the video, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy it, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, I would love to know your thoughts on this team down in the comment section and what you think their situation could look like come the expansion draft and who you might like to see the Kraken take. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace.